Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to episode 118 of Circle of Fellows. I'm Shel Holtz. I am an IABC Fellow. I am also Senior Director of Communication at WebCorps in San Francisco. And I am joined today by four of my colleagues in the College of Fellows at IABC to talk about leadership in the communication profession, which is one of those topics that's both a mile deep and a mile wide. We cover a lot of ground here. So I'm going to ask each of our participants today to introduce themselves, going clockwise as I see you on the screen. Mike, we'll start with you, and welcome to your first live stream Circle of Fellows as one of the 2025 class.
Well, thank you very much, Shel. And indeed, I am a newly minted IABC Fellow. I am based in Reykjavik, Iceland, where I have a practice mainly focused on internal and nonprofit communication. Used to do political campaigns in the States before I went in internal back in the 90s, working mainly across the Atlantic with different clients and groups there. And I'm also the editor-in-chief of Strategic Magazine, which can be found at strategic.global.
Great, thanks, Mike. Sue, you're up next.
Hi, everybody. Good to see you all. Just underscores the I in IABC with the crowd that's here today. I think we're from all over the place. Sue Human from Edmonton, Canada. I am a co-owner of a little boutique communication agency for the past 23 years. We do work mostly in all three sectors, but mostly in websites, strategic communication. We organize a lot of conferences too, which is just an interesting side gig. But happy to be here, and especially with this esteemed group.
Thanks, Sue. Robin, hi. Good to see you.
Hello. Hi, everybody. I'm Robin McCaslin. I'm Senior Director of Communications for Healthcare Service Corporation. We are the largest customer-owned health insurer in the United States. We now have more than 26 million members across the country. And in addition to our typical health products, we also are in the Medicare and Medicaid space. We offer, through some of our subsidiaries and other entities, life insurance, dental, vision, you name it. So we got the health space covered. And I am in Dallas, Texas, USA.
Great. And that leaves Russell.
Hi there. Well, so I'm Russell Grossman. I'm in London, that's London, England, and I'm the Director of Communications at the UK Rail Regulator. I'm also Director of the Government Communication Service, and in fact, I've just also stepped down after 12 years as the Head of Profession for internal communications across the UK government. Never a dull moment here in government, as you would expect from any government, but my specializations, I suppose, tend to be towards the topic today, communications leadership, internal communications and organization development.
Excellent. So I do want to let those of you who are watching in real time, and I can see that there are some of you out there, that you are invited and encouraged to participate in this conversation. There is a field where you can enter a question or a comment or an observation, and I'll be able to display that on the screen, and the panel will be able to weigh in on it. Always fun component of these conversations is bringing in the folks who are watching. So let's start this conversation from the 40,000 foot perspective. When we talk about leading communication, this could be the chief communication officer leading the entire communication function in an organization. It can also be a manager who has two people reporting to them and multiple layers above them, part of a larger organization. Handling communication in a function. It could be leadership at an agency. You could be leading your own consultancy, as some of you are, and as I did for 21 years. But all of these require certain traits, certain characteristics. For people who are aspiring to leadership in communication, what traits should they be nurturing and building?
Start with emotional intelligence. If that's not something that comes naturally to you, cultivating that, being able to demonstrate authenticity, a sense of humility, all of those things will help the people who report to you or the people who are paying attention to you to feel a sense that you are honest, that you sincerely care, and that you have their best interest in mind.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, Robin. I feel like there's two sides to this question. One is the people leadership, which you've touched on, but then there's also the communication practice leadership, where you're staying abreast of the latest innovations in technology and practice, and you are helping to guide your team toward being their very best every day. So I feel like there's two sides to this question, perhaps.
Agree.
I'd say there's three sides.
I would say one of the interesting things about communications, I think, is that it's a discipline or a practice that most people, even if they're not in the discipline or practice, think they know a lot about. And in some cases that is true, and in other cases it's not. But just picking up on Robin's humility point, I think it is important for people aspiring to communications leadership to be able to spot whether others in their organization who are non-communications practitioners actually know a lot about the practice. And if that's the case, to respect that and to have the good grace to look at that. I particularly regard that as important if you're looking with leaders. Many leaders achieve their leadership in an organization because they are good communicators. And if they're good communicators, they probably know something innately or otherwise about communications. So that humility point and good grace, I think, is really important in terms of the kind of skill set that you should be aspiring to.
Mike, any thoughts?
I think there's actually three elements to it. One is, the extent to which we can develop ourselves as leaders in a corporate context, leading a function, interacting with leaders, those relationship piece. But there's also a separate piece around what I call communication leadership, which really focuses on maximizing the value and impact that we can deliver uniquely as communication professionals. And, we can talk about that at some length later in the conversation, but I think there's, a clear distinction to be made about leadership within the hierarchical context and then the leadership role that we have through the work that we do.
I've always seen communications leadership as pointing in kind of four directions. You're obviously, if you have a team, you're obviously leading that team. If you are counseling seniors, then you are leading them in the practice. If you are part of an organization like IABC, then you have a leadership out to the profession. And then I think for peers who are non-communications practitioners, there is a leadership role there which allows them to understand the value of communications, which is a leadership role that we often need to peddle, I will say, in order that people do understand that the value of our practice has value.
And I had another thought related to what you were talking about, Russell, which is many people who are not in our profession, but many people are promoted into roles in their organizations because of their technical skill or whatever, engineering, whatever it might be that they do. But if they don't have the other skills, then that can become a weakness for them. I've been talking about this with my own leadership and some others that I work with in my own organization and my team, where there's an opportunity to help that, because communication, in my estimation, and there are a lot of research studies and white papers and whatever, and it's so critical to ultimately how successful you can be. And so I've seen it happen, and I'm sure you all have as well, where somebody got promoted because they were brilliant in one area, but when it came to communication, they were not. It did not come innately. They were introverted maybe, or maybe they're just like, that's not part of my role. That's not why I was promoted. And it's like, oh, but it is part of your role now. And I think that's something that they need to develop.
Well, that's an interesting point, Rob, and I've long wondered about the issue of managers as communicators in organizations as part of the process. I mean, I think they're vitally important, but most managers are promoted based on their achievements as individual contributors. They don't necessarily have management skills, which would include communication, which makes it a challenge to communicate consistently through managers. So I'm wondering how y'all think about the notion that being a communication leader means taking some accountability, some responsibility for the cultivation of managers or a culture of managing in an organization.
I think that's spot on, Shell. I think one of the things that we ought to be doing in communications leadership is understanding where individual managers in the organization are or are not in their own communications leadership. The further up the management tree you go, the more likely it is that you need to be a good communicator. Incidentally, I never describe myself or people in my practice as communicators. My own view is that the communicators are the managers. And as you observe in an organization, those people who have, if you like, been promoted for technical reasons, but not for their managerial ability, spotting those people out and, if you like, triaging them based on the needs of the organization and reaching out to them to see how they can be assisted by you, I think is really quite important.
Yeah, teach them those soft skills. Any other thoughts on that from anyone?
Yeah,
Sure. I mean,
no, go ahead, Mike.
Go ahead.
No, you go ahead.
Okay, so I'm somebody who's always been a bit skeptical about the emphasis placed on the communication role of managers, because I often see, particularly in internal communication circles, a desire to default to management communication, because a lot of people believe that there's research that says that managers are the preferred source of information. Now, managers are a critical source of communication, particularly when employees feel insecure about certain things, about their jobs, about their work arrangements, about what's going to impact them based on different agendas that they're hearing about. But at the same time, I think as much as it's important to support managers in becoming more effective at communication, one of the key ways we do that, and it's not emphasized nearly enough, is the extent to which we try to reduce the communication burden on managers to the absolute minimum so that they can be used as effectively as possible. And, the stuff that's not requiring a manager's involvement gets shifted to other channels that are better suited for that.
That's a key point, Mike. And yeah, I understand and agree with what you're saying. We also have looked at, like in my own organization, which is a pretty large company, we look at different surveys that are conducted periodically throughout the year, and we look at how senior somebody is. So you're an individual contributor, you're a manager, you're a director, you're a vice president, whatever. We look at all these different things. And then we look at employee feedback about where you see a dip, where you see those leaders not buying into something or complaining about something. And then we see same thing with individual contributors, and in the open-end comments and how they're responding to questions, it's like there's a gap. So you're right. Maybe part of it is that the burden needs to come off them. On the other hand, there's still a very strong belief among rank and file employees that it's like, I want more from that. I need more from my supervisor or my leader. I'm not getting that. And it's not being communicated. News is not being communicated consistently from that leadership level.
And so what you all are describing, in my view, is really the role of the strategic communication leader within an organization. You've picked up on those little pieces that need work, perhaps, in the organization, individuals who need support, corporate materials and things that can be used as templates and guidelines for them, whether or not you're going to use the cascade method, which is a much debated and time-honored method of communication in an organization. But all of these tactics, in my mind, really underscore the role of strategic communication leader within an organization. And that's what we do. We assess the situation, we find the right tools and methods, we support people in leadership roles. That is the job of a strategic communication leader, in my view.
I would
just
go ahead, Rustin.
And I'm just reflecting on what is the de facto role of that strategic communications leader to point out to the C-suite, perhaps managers a little bit further down the organization, who could become even better leaders if they were better communicators, not necessarily with their teams, but perhaps for the organization, senior spokespeople, for example, or the way that they may interpret change in transformation programs within their organization. And I think one of the things about communications practitioners is we often have, particularly at a more senior level, but not necessarily so, not exclusively so, we often have the run of the organization to be able to do that, rather than, in a sense, just be stood in our box. And I think, since we're talking about communications leadership, I think that proactive leadership from communications practitioners into the C-suite, I think, is a value add that we bring, even though we may not be asked for it all the time.
Yeah, my view on managers as communicators is that they are interpreters. They understand the situation on the ground where they work better than anybody else, and are better positioned to explain change, for example, to their employees. How is this going to affect us in this team? And they need to be equipped with the resources to help them do that, not just the training to help them communicate effectively in general, but the resources to help them communicate this change. For example, we have 2 manager publications that come out of the department where I work. One is monthly, and it's called Manager Talking Points, and it starts with 3 or 4 bullets saying these are things that we would like you to emphasize with your teams in the month ahead. And the other is called Manager Briefing. They come out as needed, and they're single topic FAQs to help them answer questions that their employees may bring to them around a given change. And I think that if we're going to be asking our managers to serve as translators or interpreters of messages that are delivered from the top down, we need to be adept at doing that ourselves. If you are the manager of, say, the intranet, and you have 2 or 3 people who report to you, isn't it just as important that you be good at translating these messages, interpreting what's coming from above so that people know how it affects them? Having those soft skills in your toolkit?
It's even more important, because actually it's difficult to be a light unto others if you're not a light unto your own team. So I think it's really important. Yeah.
By the way, Aduvi Martin, whom I met at conference in Vancouver in June, says, love the idea of manager talking points and employee FAQs sent frequently, not just as is needed or when there's a crisis. So there's that.
You know when you've met Aduvi Martin.
That's right. No question about that. Sue, I wonder, based on some conversation we had before, about how important it is, if you are aspiring to a leadership role, to speak the language of leaders. Since we all come up as individual contributors, and what we do is sort of a crafty occupation. By that I mean we're engaged in the craft of writing and producing collateral and things like that. We tend to speak the language of that craft. And when promoted, you go into leadership and you talk about hits and views and, letting and kerning and what have you. That does not resonate or inspire a lot of confidence in your leadership abilities with leaders. So what do communicators need to understand about speaking that language of leadership?
Yeah, absolutely. Shell, I started going to IABC World Conference, I don't know, like 25 years ago. And even before then, the topic of, how do we get a seat at the table I mean, my goodness, it still is discussed today. And the real answer is demonstrating your value to senior leadership. And to do that, you need to speak the language of business. So you need to be able to talk about performance metrics and measurable objectives that actually contribute to the organization, not just to your comms plan outcome, right? You have to be able to say, this is how we're going to move the needle on important issues for the organization. You need to talk about ROI. You need to talk about investment. So using the language of business when you're in those boardroom meetings or in your correspondence with senior executives really demonstrates that you understand what keeps them awake at night and how communication is contributing to solving those issues.
And the thing I would add to that, I coach some other organizations that come to me in various ways within the company because they want to understand that better. So they're not people in my own organization necessarily. But what I always remind them is beyond everything that Sue said, which I agree with wholeheartedly, is leaders are different. Maybe they're not, but I mean, they have their own responsibilities and things that they have to deal with on a daily basis. And so when I'm coaching people on how you're going to approach this, I'm like, okay, if they tell you their assistant or tells you have 30 minutes, assume you have 15, and you better get to the point up front. Like in our organization, I've said this before, we use Axios Media Smart Brevity for how we communicate with employees. Works really well. They are totally down with it. We've been doing it for almost 6 years. But when you're presenting, it's the same thing. It's like, don't go in, Shell, to your point, where it's like, you know all the stuff and you're so involved in it and you're so passionate about it. And you're like, I want to tell you everything and all the back step to how we got to this recommendation. And it's like, no, tell me up front what your recommendation is, and then give me the key points about why this is going to matter to a senior leader, how it's going to impact the organization, cost, all those things that are critical. And then you have all that detail in the back of your head. So when you only have those few minutes, because you would inevitably get cut short, you can answer those questions. But it's like you have to learn to think differently about how you are when you're in the presence of a senior leader.
This is so true. And I can recall a few years ago, I was asked by someone in the C-suite who had to make a presentation to their colleagues at the boardroom table. And they were told they could only have 6 slides. They came to me with like 30 slides. And I helped them edit it down to 6 slides, got to the point. The manager had all of the detail, to your point, Robin, as sort of back pocket notes. But when you are presenting to senior leaders, get to the point, get to what's in it for me from their perspective, and don't talk a lot about hits and communication metrics. Talk about how you're going to help them solve their problems.
In order to do that, and as Sue and Robin, absolutely right, of course, you need a good insight into what their problems are. And particularly if you're in, say, a technical business, one similar to mine, I suppose, which is mostly focused on a kind of engineering and regulation and the like, you need to understand the language of that business specifically. And the earlier that you can do that, the earlier you can make an impression. And it is interesting to see how people do respond much more positively when you talk to them in their own jargon, but obviously in a way that you understand it.
Managing your own onboarding is absolutely critical in that type of situation, because no one's necessarily going to teach you that lingo. And particularly if you're coming in from another organization, you may be very well trained in standard business terminology or standard KPIs or standard issues. But if you're moving into something that's, for example, rail regulation, as Russell's been involved with, you've got to be able to learn those specifics quickly, and you can't necessarily expect the person above you to train you in all of it.
Yeah, although with the coaching trend in management, I think there's an increasing expectation that a manager will do that. But two quick thoughts. One, and this, I was glad to hear you say this, Sue. I was just listening to a podcast on my drive home yesterday, in which Christopher S. Penn, I don't know if you all know Chris Penn, just sort of casually mentioned ROI and made the point that if you're talking about ROI, you're talking about money. don't use that term if you're not talking about money. And I think a lot of communicators tend to use it very generically as this is the benefit that is accrued as a result of what we have done. This is the ROI of our campaign. And if you say that at a board table when you leave, they're going to go, he doesn't know what ROI is, right? There's a very specific accounting formula for ROI. The other thought was just a quick story that I feel compelled to share based on the conversation about CEOs and what they want to talk about. I did have a CEO once where, and this was many, many years ago, but it was a Fortune 400 company. And I took in the tissues for the design of the annual report that year. And what we were looking for was his buy-in to the theme and the concept that was going to anchor everything that we were going to write in the annual report. And he put on his reading glasses and he looked at it very carefully. I was sitting there with the designer next to me, and he looked up and he said, "There's too much space between the lines." This was a CEO who actually did care about the leading. There was one.
I actually had somebody try and read Lorem Ipsum once. I presented a concept. So yeah, what language is this? It's not.
Yeah, I worked with a CEO once a long time ago. Well, wasn't that long ago, where and he literally said this when communication was written for him. We would do, single space, da, 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 da. And he'd go in and he'd be like, I don't know who's writing this, but there needs to be 2 spaces between sentences. And we politely tried to explain that ended a long time ago. And he goes, no, I was in the AV club in high school, and I learned about journalism too. And I know, and we were just like, oh my God. So we literally, I love that word, literally, we sent out his messages with 2 spaces. We didn't do it in anything else, but that's what he wanted. And we could not convince him otherwise. So
that's amazing.
And that also points to the issue we talked quite rightly about, understanding the language of your business and the language of business. But also, if you're counseling senior leaders, CEO, the managing director, you need to know what also is bugging them at the minor level, whether it's the leading on the paper, whether it's the font, whether it's the color. I once worked for a gentleman, I won't say who it was, but it was a very senior person who insisted on a 2.5-inch margin on the left-hand side of all scripts that were presented to him, so he could put what were called in the business inky blues together. And that's how it was, and that's what he wanted. The point here being that although these may seem minor irritants, if you don't overcome those, you'll never get to the bigger stuff that you want to counsel or advise on, because they will always be irritated by something that happens to be in their little set of foibles.
Yeah, important to get to know them and what their preferences are. In terms of being strategic, how important is it to accommodate what you know about executive biases and preferences versus being bold and going in with what you know will work as you're aspiring to that seat at the table, which is a whole other conversation that we can have, maybe we will, but if that is the aspiration, how do you treat your proposals, your strategic plans for the business?
I like to present my very best work, and then see if it matches with the expectations of the leader. If the leader has something specific in mind, I try and understand why. What outcome are they trying to achieve with that particular, whether it's a tool, whether it's a color of the rainbow, God only knows. What is it you're trying to achieve? And then see if we can either compromise or at least have that person hear me. At the end of the day, it's their money, honey. So, if they really want you to do something, and it's not the best practice from your view, and you've made your case, then you just kind of have to do it. But I feel like you have to at least be heard and present things in a way that they will hear you and respect your expertise and give it full consideration before they make a decision.
And everything aligned with the business direction and the priority, like everything you do 99% of the time is tied to what the company is trying to achieve. What's the business trying to achieve? What is this division trying to achieve? And showing that your communication is focused on those opportunities to help support whatever it is they're trying to achieve. I won't say anything else. There are times when you're doing other things, but most of the time it's aligned with what the business wants to achieve. And that usually gets their attention.
I think this is a fundamental point, actually. So the first rule of communications is to listen, and then to apply, and through that to influence. And ultimately where I think you want to get to here is to influence your C-suite or your managing director or whoever it is in what you believe is right, but also recognize, from what I also said earlier and the bit about good grace, that they may have some ideas which are possibly worth incorporating as well. And so particularly if I go into a room and I have the opportunity to listen first rather than talk, I'll always do that, because it allows you to tailor your comments, remarks, approach to the audience, and through that come at it with them as a partnership. And through that, then influence that partnership through your own ideas, what you believe is right, etc. But I think it is a fundamental issue in strategic communications that I don't believe that we should go in and insist on an idea just because we think ours is the only idea.
I'll add one thing. I was thinking of it while Shell was asking about it. But if you're asked, so you're doing what you're doing, right, and you're sharing what you're sharing, and I'm sure you've all had these opportunities as well. If somebody says, well, what about this? They have some off the wall, and it's like, you have an idea. That's when you speak up with that. It's not that you don't have other opportunities, but it's like they just opened the door for you. And if you have that idea you want to push that you didn't think would fly before, and it's well articulated and again aligned with business, but maybe it's a little atypical for what you would typically do, that's the time to do it. They're asking you, they're inviting you for that feedback. Generally, I have found that's a good time to do that.
Well, there's another way to go about it, particularly if you don't have a lot of face time or conversation with the leader or with the leadership group. What I do sometimes, and I've often had decent success with this, is draft something or prepare something from two different angles. Angle one being what you think the leader will accept, what you think, where you think their pain threshold is, if you will, their comfort zone on a particular topic. So provide that version, but also provide an alternative version, which would be what I call the what would you do if you had that person's role version, which would be a bit bolder, a bit more ambitious, and potentially could provoke some sharper thinking or more ambitious positioning on their part. What I found is when they see, and I wouldn't do this all the time, obviously, but where they see the gap between the two, either they'll go in another direction or they'll go at least somewhere between the more conservative version and the more ambitious version. Occasionally, they'll go with the more ambitious version, in which case you, as a communication leader, have actually moved the needle in the organization.
We have a comment from Mirko, one of our regular viewers. Good to see you, Mirko. Thanks for all the great advice. Can you share your top communications tip for business leaders who are trying to forge partnerships with other organizations, whether businesses, schools, or community groups? Community outreach.
Comment about listening is a really good starting point. What is it they want to get out of that partnership? Is it money? Is it sponsorship? Is it political clout? What have you? Because once you get what they're interested in, then you can figure out what it makes sense for you to contribute to help them achieve their goal in a way that forwards your agenda as well.
I would say also you meet a need that that maybe they haven't even brought up. So for example, I realize healthcare is handled very differently in different countries. In my organization, because we're in the health insurance space, and I'm really proud of this, our company has invested millions, and I mean millions of dollars in things that will support the community for people who are underserved, who may not have access to health insurance or the opportunity to even have an annual physical or just get their the basic blood work, the basic stuff checked. We invest in areas where they have food deserts, in other words, to try to get more nutritious foods into areas where that's a problem. We have spent a lot of money in the states that we serve on free fitness courts that anybody can go to in a city park. We mean what we say when we do that. Our own government relations people go into the communities because they want to understand, if they're trying to represent us at the federal level, they want to understand and hear from people directly, and they have good relationships with our plans that have relationships there. So I think that's something, because you're delivering something without even being asked, that's going to be real value add, and that sets you up to be a good partner for future things that you may want to do with a community, or they may want from you, but you've already proven yourself to be a really good partner with that organization or with that community.
And if you're trying to be the one who is forging this partnership, which is kind of what I read in your question, I think that what you want to start with is to figure out where your organization and the other are aligned, whether it's on values, whether it's on services. Perhaps there's something that you do that the other organization needs, and there can be some reciprocity there. So I think that, finding alignment between the two organizations and seeing how we can help each other achieve our business or social corporate goals can be a great way to start a conversation. So if you're the one initiating, for sure. Yeah.
I think my top comms tip would be cautious. Do you know why you want to do this, to Mike's point? And perhaps also ask the key question, how at the end of this project would you want to extricate yourself from it? Some CEOs, MDs, etc., boards even go into this, and then over a perhaps short period of time, 2 or 3 years, the CEO has been run under a bus. The board has changed, and actually the strategic direction is no longer what it was, or maybe the money is no longer there. So but you may have created an expectation in the business or the school or the community group. So I think before you go into something like this, just my top tip, apart from be cautious, would then be just be careful that that if you needed to pull out, how you would pull out. And that might be, for example, establishing expectations right at the start. That this may not be an open-ended thing. We'll give it a pilot. We'll try it for a year, maybe a couple of years, etc. I think that's really quite important.
Yeah, and have a partnership agreement. When you go into this, understand who's doing what success looks like. To your point, Russell, how do you extricate yourself? The expectations on both sides, I think, will really set you up for a positive experience.
Yeah, just a logistical point. Some organizations have outreach managers. My organization does. This is mostly for labor type groups and for underprivileged services that serve the underprivileged and move them into the construction trades. But they may have a lot of insights about how to build these partnerships. They may even have contacts for you. So if there's somebody like that in your organization, maybe worth reaching out. And Mirko offers his thanks for all of that. Many years ago, there was an IABC leader named Dean Landesh. Some of you may remember Dean. He wrote an article, I think it was in the old Communication World magazine, in which he said, most leaders perceive communicators as hired guns. The folks who are brought in to clean up the town after the mess has been made. We were not at the table when the decision was made. We were not able to provide counsel to say that this decision is going to have some serious negative repercussions that we need to prepare for, or maybe even consider changing this decision. How do you build the trust with the senior executive team in an organization so that they want your input at the time the decision is being made and not after?
I think a lot of the things that communications leadership is founded on is relationships, both at the individual level and at the group level as well. So, what is your reputation as an individual practitioner in the organization? But beyond that, how many people do you personally know, and particularly people in the organization of influence? What do they think about your performance? How do they regard you? Do you know this? My experience of, and I've worked in 13 different organizations in a 40+ year career, is that you go into an organization and you are aiming always to do the things that I've just described, but also get to a position where you can influence the organization at the right level in the right time. And that also means that if you see something which could have happened if you'd have been in the room, but you weren't in the room, don't be afraid to come back afterwards and say, if I'd have been around, you have to temper how you say this, but if I'd have been around, the result there would have been different. And that requires a certain degree of boldness. It requires a certain degree of courage and a certain degree of chutzpah. But equally, if you are too timid and you just stay in your box, and I know that's a theme that I mentioned before, then you're not going to be the best communications leader for that organization.
I would tack on to what you're saying, Russell, because I was thinking about several examples while you were saying that. I have seen instances where somebody I work with, maybe my boss, maybe me, maybe my peers, who have had the opportunity to advise, and the advice was not taken at all. And then when things went awry, as we thought they might, some will come back and go, but what? Why is this? Why is this audience upset? And we're like, as we said, politely and respectfully, it's like, the reason we suggested this, once again, is X, Y, and Z. And I have found sometimes that when those things happen, and they're like, okay, you're back at the table and we're paying closer attention because of what happened previously. And I hate that anybody gets burned in those situations, but sometimes that's a good opportunity to say, remember when? And yeah, sometimes that helps.
I remember one of the times that I was invited to the big table as a participant. The CEO wanted me there. The other executives were not sure. Wasn't personal. It was just they'd never had someone from a communication leadership perspective sit at the big table. So I had to agree that I wouldn't, quote, vote on anything, because that was their purview and not mine. However, after only a couple of meetings where I sort of heard what they were talking about, a new initiative or something, and I chimed in with some, perspectives from either the audience or the employee perspective, and just said, something you might want to think about. After a time, they started to look to me every time they presented something to see if I had a reaction or a perspective to bring from an audience. So I think that if you can demonstrate your value that way, if you can reflect the thinking or the perspective of your audiences, that's often something that leaders in the C-suite don't think about as they're trying to mush through the mechanics of their proposal.
And I think if you can put actual data behind those instincts and those inclinations, then you're doing something that they wouldn't be able to or wouldn't have the inclination to do. I mean, where I've been successful in organizations, it's been a combination of responsiveness and meeting their expectations, especially initially, and proactivity, particularly in terms of bringing hard data to the table that says, this is what people are thinking, this is what they're saying, this is the extent to which they're aligned with where you are, et cetera. And not just numbers, but also hard-hitting quotes from actual people that can tend to have a positive impact, or at least a decisive impact on some of the conversations you have.
Michael, we do that on the reg. We have quarterly dashboards that go in depth about things like town halls that have happened over the past quarter, other communication, the open-ended feedback. We do monthly dashboards that's on internal, external, reputation management, all the things that communications touches. And we do our own surveys twice a year outside of what HR does to get that, not only have the employees answer questions, but that open-ended feedback is the best stuff. And we always summarize that, and that information is available for senior leaders and is shared with them and used to advise them on future communication opportunities and maybe what we can do better, or maybe what we do more of, or maybe instances where it's like, no, you shouldn't communicate right now. Like, we use it for all those things. And yeah, it's been effective. It took us a little while to get it up and running, but now in fact, that function is part of my team. And I'm really proud of that group because they turn out a very good product. And we also get great data from the rest of our organization, and it matters. It makes a difference in how we interact with the leadership that we work with.
It does make a big difference. And having that discipline of knowing that every quarter you have promised your board a dashboard. No, you have that discipline of making sure that you know how good you are, but also where there are deficiencies, where you need to improve. It's not just a question, and you definitely don't want to go just to your board with all the good stuff, because otherwise they'll ask, okay, this is the good stuff, but where's the stuff that you haven't given us? And so I think that giving that warts and all approach, this is assuming that your team is good, of course, giving that warts and all approach also engenders trust by the board of the communications team. And that's important as well.
Russell, you talked at the beginning of this conversation about building the relationships in order to build trust with the leadership team and identifying who's influential. How do you do that? How do you figure out who has the influence among the organization's leaders for the tone of communication or the issues that we're going to address? How do you do that?
I think that's a key skill of anybody that is leading communications, is to understand the people in the organization, to understand what their history in the organization is, to know what their preferences are, how they get on with their teams, what their teams say about them, where their past successes and failures in the business have been, how their own peers regard them. When I was at the BBC, which I think is long enough ago, 25 years to be able to talk about it now, we ran an exercise called Cryptonomics, which we got an external organization coming in to find out how different parts of the BBC regarded each other. The results were fascinating. But having that kind of knowledge, I think, is fundamental to be able to operate in an effective way as a communications leader. And it also, of course, informs how you want to conjure relations and influence with the right people in the organization. What you don't want to be doing, particularly as a senior leader, is spending a lot of time with people, frankly, that have less influence. That's not to criticize those people. They are probably very hard-working people providing value in their organization. But the people that you want to be spending time with are those that provide, that have the influence in the organization. Why? Because ultimately you're delivering value for the organization by doing that.
Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry. I'm just going to say, I think you can also check the body language around the board table. So the people with influence are the ones where when they speak, people sit up and pay attention. And so you want to try and understand sort of who's who in the zoo there. And it's not always a hierarchical thing in terms of who has influence. Sometimes it's the lawyer, the corporate lawyer at the table has the influence, or sometimes it's the chief financial officer. So just check body language and see who's paying attention to who, and that will give you an insight as to who actually listens to their colleagues.
Yeah, I'll give you a great example. I think it's a great example. When I worked for a major HR consulting firm, one of our clients was a global hotel company. They run hotels all over. Then they have low-end hotels, high-end hotels, all the things. And they were trying to actually support their employees at all levels who were not necessarily participating in the benefits available to them in the country, their medical opportunity, their other things that the company would offer. And so we did a lot of listening. We looked at their surveys. We paid attention to behaviors that we saw when we were interacting with people. And what we figured out in this case was that some people at lower levels of the organization, but that are absolutely critical to the organization, like housekeepers in their hotels, trusted the head housekeeper. They didn't trust their man. It wasn't that the management had done anything janky. They trusted the head housekeeper. And sometimes, depending on the corner of the world they were in, language was an issue, but they always trusted that housekeeper. And so one of the things we did is we said, we need you. We tapped them to help be the influencers for, look, these things are available to you. This doesn't cost you anything. They just didn't understand it, and they didn't know who to listen to, but that was who they listened to. And so we did that. And then they saw their enrollment go up, which, is an expense to the company, but that's what they wanted. They wanted to support these people, not have as much turnover, offer them all the things they could so that they could build their own careers there. And that's how we did it. But it took some paying attention first to go, who's influential? It was head housekeepers. It wasn't a management. It wasn't senior leadership. It wasn't a corporate spokesperson. You got to pay attention.
I want to talk about the table for a minute. Yeah, I telegraphed this earlier. We had an episode of Circle of Fellows some time ago. Jim Lukashevsky was one of the participants, and he mocked the table. He said, where is this table exactly? How big is it? His view is that being at the table is not nearly as important as being the person that the leader wants to pick up the phone and call before the meeting at the table ever occurs. Is this something you would agree with? And what do you need to do to become that kind of person?
You need to be a trusted advisor. You need to be the trusted advisor that the CEO goes to, presuming it's the CEO who wants to speak to you ahead of the meeting. And you need to be able to offer insights and perspectives that maybe they hadn't thought of. And then if you do that, then there's a better chance that not only will you have the CEO's ear prior to the meeting, the CEO will probably call on you during the meeting to offer your insights for the benefit of the group.
Jim Lukashevsky is amazing. I remember first coming across him, precisely I know when it was in Chicago in 2002, and I couldn't believe that he managed to lead a whole session basically off the back of a business card. And I think he's right. My conclusion after many years practice is that you don't need to be at the table, but you do need to be round the table. Sometimes communications practitioners are most effective when they are in the room but not part of the group, because that allows us to hold a mirror to the group without actually having, if you like, the leg in the group that prevents us doing something different. And to the trusted advisor point, which Sue is absolutely right on, you have to do your legwork in the organization in order to be a trusted advisor. It's all the things that we've talked about today. It's knowing the business inside out. It's understanding who the influencers are. It's understanding what the CEO is worried about, whether it's the small things or the big things. And it's also being able to see round corners. It is having enough nous to be able to see things, if you like, from a distance that often the board can't see because they're right in the middle of might be a crisis or in the middle of the situation. And if you're a trusted advisor sufficiently to be able to do what I describe as be the grit in the oyster without being the pin in the balloon, but also the jester at the court of King Lear. In other words, know when you can make a suggestion that is a little bit radical, but not so radical that people decry it, and say the things that nobody else wants to say.
Well, I think there's also another piece around not necessarily seeking your own seat at the table or seeking the CEO's ear right away. Sometimes you need to build up your standing within the organization by focusing on getting some allies around that table first. I mean, in an organization that's got an operating board or an executive board, chances are there are at least one, probably two people to start with who have some demand for your services, whether it's getting their agenda point up on the priority list or getting their profile up in the organization. Having a couple of allies at that table, particularly if they're not your boss, is definitely going to help accelerate that process to being a trusted advisor, because you've got a couple of people on that table who see you as one to begin with. That's potentially going to soften the CEO up. I mean, there's a lot of focus on us having direct influence with the CEO, which is a great thing, but having direct influence with people who value your contribution initially can help you get that, and may be an easier focus when you start.
I think we have time for one more topic, and let's look at those communication leaders who are maybe lower in the communication structure, managing a team within a communication function. What do they need to do to be able to move up that hierarchy if they aspire to run a communications function at the most senior level?
I think they need to demonstrate that they have the managerial skills, the leadership skills to be part of the overall group, who can look outside just the communication function and look at the entire business, and see how you can offer insights or opportunities, training, coaching, whatever it may be, to really sort of advance your ability to influence the organization.
And I think listening up front is really important. So if you are new to an organization, or you're more recently out of school, or whatever it might be, don't come into any situation thinking you know the answer or trying to demonstrate you know the answer. I think listening to people first and understanding their pain points, where they're coming from, what they perceive the issues to be, because you'll learn a lot that you might not have picked up on otherwise. That helps a lot too, because people remember that. And then when they see it acted upon in how you're communicating or what you're supporting as a communication professional, they're more likely to go, she listened to me, he listened to me, and this is what I saw as a result. Now you're starting to gain more influence and people trusting you. So when you're in that leadership role and you say stuff, people believe you, and are ready to go with you. I hate to say into battle, but they're ready to go with you when you are working on something significant, because you've already demonstrated that you're paying attention to them and you care about what they care about.
And to progress in that way, I think you need three things: grit, tenacity, and resilience. Grit, because you need to knuckle down and be prepared to do work, and sometimes work quite hard in order to achieve what it is that you're trying to achieve. Tenacity, because you need to hold on, and you need to continue with it, even though it feels that it may at times be a lost cause. Often it isn't. And resilience, because there are times when you will be knocked down verbally. Hopefully, not physically, you will be knocked down in the organization, and you need to have the resilience to get up and recognize that saying that I often have is that 6 out of 10 is success, because you recognize that you can come around for the other 4. If you attempt to achieve everything in one go, then sometimes you will exhaust yourself, you will drop out, and it just won't happen. So grit, tenacity, and resilience.
If I were to just add one thing, it would be to focus on asking good questions rather than coming up with great answers. Because particularly if you're more junior in your career, you have a lot more permission to ask questions. And if you ask questions that are noticeably good, people will notice the quality of the questions, and they'll notice your confidence in being willing to ask them. And that's, and pretty much any conclusion that you can come to in life, you can always rephrase as a question. So if you don't feel you have the permission to propose answers right out of the box, being able to ask good questions visibly is a good way to move up the ladder.
I have always operated under the philosophy that my job is to make my boss look good. And I have found that works really well. I continue to abide by that. One other point I want to make very quickly as we wind down, I think this was out of the USC Annenberg School survey. I would want to verify that before I committed myself to that citation. But the study indicated that a rather large percentage, more than half, of the communication, I think it was managers that were surveyed, did not know what their company's business plan was and had not read it. And I just found that staggering. I don't know how you can aspire to a leadership role when you don't know what the path is that you're your company is on.
Wow.
Yeah, that's
That is
gets back to
astonishing.
that understanding management. I want to thank everybody for your time and your insights today. This has been a terrific conversation. I do also want to thank Anna Marie Willie for all of her hard work in coordinating these sessions every month. And she has assembled a great panel for August, episode 119 on Thursday, August 21st. At 4 p.m. Eastern Time. We bounce these times around to accommodate the time zones of our fellows. Our topic in August is sustaining sustainability. How do we keep it front and center in our organizations? Panelists in this episode will be Zora Artis out of Australia, Brent Carey from Canada, Bonnie Caver from the US, and Martha Muzichka from Canada. So another international contingent. Looking forward to that one. Hope to see all of you who watch live next month. Thanks, everybody. It's been great.